Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to address you today and to share the podium with such an esteemed group of speakers. No doubt for a symposium about energy, the power of the collective expertise assembled in Salt Lake City this weekend more than matches our theme. At the outset, I must also confess that for me, it is somewhat of an intimidating prospect to speak immediately after Terry Root. My wife claims I have taken my use of sports analogies to a level so epidemic it's irresponsible. But I studied under Dr. Root a number of years ago at Michigan, and so it is a particular honor for me to be on the same program with her. It's kind of like growing up playing basketball in local gyms here in Utah, and then getting to play on the same team with John Stockton and Karl Malone in the pros. But enough of introductions. Please allow me to turn to the substance of what I have to say today. About United States energy law and policy, Wendell Berry, a student of Wallace Stegner's at Stanford, I might add, wrote this in 1992. Under the rule of the free market ideology, we have gone through 2 decades of an energy crisis without an effective energy policy. Because of an easy and thoughtless reliance on imported oil, we have no adequate policy for the conservation of gasoline and other petroleum products. We have no adequate policy for the development or use of other, less harmful forms of energy. Berry's assertion that by the early 1990s this nation had proceeded with what was effectively no real cohesive energy policy rang for me. Thinking of that assertion standing on the edge of this century's next decade, it reminded me of another refrain from a very different context. In the very year after Berry penned his words, the federal appellate court that sits in Washington, D.C., gave FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a decided tongue lashing on a narrow question of administrative law and natural gas rate-making rules that I promise I will not bore you with here. The court said this: "This court has consistently disallowed attempts to blur the line between sections 4 and 5 of the Natural Gas Act. As we complained 4 years ago, on 4 occasions in the last 3 years, this court has reviewed commission efforts to compromise Section 5's limits on its power to revise rates. On each, the court has repelled the commission's gambit. This is number 5. We now make it an even 6. On the face of this language, the court's statement has no bearing on Mr. Berry's, but the conjunction of the two ideas raised this question for me, a question I believe we cannot escape. If in 1990 we were already at 2 decades of no discernible national energy policy, clearly by 2000 we were at 3. So the question is this: as we look around the corner to 2010, are we about to make it an even 4? The title of my presentation this morning is Energy Regulation Today and Tomorrow, and by asking about energy regulation as a question of tomorrow, I intend to pose precisely this question: can or will the crisis of climate change propel us to a new form of energy regulation that is integrated with the regulation of environmental protection and resource use? In short, a form of energy regulation aimed at long-term sustainability. My thesis is that while climate change hangs as a great unparalleled challenge to humankind that humankind must rise up to meet, at the same time, it presents us with an unparalleled opportunity to transform the way we think about our society, our lives, ourselves. Necessarily, that opportunity is also one to alter a key driver of what makes us who we are: how we regulate energy, our energy policy. What I would like to do then proceeds in 3 parts. First, I would like to offer a brief overview of current energy regulation, or what Professor Joseph Tomaine refers to as the dominant energy paradigm. Second, I would like to frame what I thus refer to as the dominant alternative energy policy paradigm. Together, these 2 topics form the today portion of the energy regulation question. Finally, then, I would like to turn to the tomorrow portion of this question, assessing whether how climate change may help us transform energy regulation and pointing to a handful of examples of how we may begin down that path. So, Energy Regulation Today and Professor Tomein's Dominant Energy Policy Paradigm. It was only 2 years prior to Wendell Berry's essay when Professor Tomein, in an article published in the University of Colorado Law Review, provided his tour de force assessment of the modern United States energy policy landscape. Professor Tomein's paradigm boiled down to these 5 points. Energy policy in the United States, from the conception of energy regulation really through today, has focused on, first, assessing or assuring abundant supplies of energy. Second, maintaining reasonable prices. Third, limiting the ability of the players in the industry to exercise market power and set non-competitive prices. Fourth, promoting price and quality competition among fuels, which is really the flip side of the third prong. And fifth, focusing on supporting a very limited number of what we might refer to as conventional fuels. Now, if you have spent any time living in the United States in the last half century or so, you don't need a law professor, Professor Tomein or me, to tell you that these 5 pillars, and particularly the concept of maintaining abundant energy supplies at low prices, is what drives how we make energy decisions in this country. As political scientist Gary Briner has put it, energy policy making in the United States is a cyclical enterprise. When energy prices rise rapidly, rapidly because of limited supplies, energy dominates the political agenda. When supplies are plentiful and prices are stable, it fades into the background. But the results of the dominant energy policy paradigm are as ineluctable as its construct. What has this dominant model wrought? A rather static image. This slide shows the sources from which the United States has drawn its energy consumption, expressed as percentages over roughly the last 55 years. As you can see, without exception, in every year, our nation has drawn essentially 90% or more of our energy from fossil fuels and nuclear power, but only about 9% from renewable sources, and even then only about 4% from renewable sources other than hydroelectric power. Given that we have, for all intents and purposes, abandoned the era of dam building in the United States, these trends are stark indeed. Another way of thinking about the dominant paradigm of energy regulation and the goals it focuses on is this. Energy regulation and environmental regulation historically have been distinct. The two existed in separate spheres. Energy regulators focused on economics. Environmental regulators concentrated on pollution, risk, and land use. And as Kipling might have observed, never shall the twain meet. Today, this distinction has been blurred to a degree, but the degree is small. Let's take a concrete example, a coal-fired power plant. Even in our modern regime of the administrative state and the intensive regulation that comes with it, the regulatory oversight that a typical coal plant undergoes is multifarious, but not necessarily overlapping, much less intertwined. Energy regulation of the plant would derive from traditional principles of public utility and necessity law and antitrust. Federal regulators, chiefly at the FERC, and state regulators, chiefly at the pertinent State Public Utilities Commission, will control a number of things, and they're all about economics. The rates at which power plants can sell its energy on the wholesale market and the price at which that power may be sold to you and me. The procurement of this generated electricity by the entities that sell us the energy, namely whether such purchases and investments are prudent, and the siting of the plant in the first instance, typically focusing on its public necessity, or in other words, whether it is necessary to help provide a reliable, abundant supply of energy. The environmental regulations, or regulators with purview over such a plant, will have no less intrusive measures to impose, but the measures will have far less to do with economics and competition, and far more with abating ecological and public harm to the natural and human environment. Modern environmental law can be sliced many ways, but one is to see environmental laws as falling into 4 primary categories, virtually all of which would apply to our hypothetical coal plant here. The air and water pollution the facility creates would be subject to control under pollution prevention laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Any hazardous substances created by the plant would require proper disposal and cleanup under statutes that have wonderful names like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or CERCLA, or RCRA, I apologize, or Superfund, which I will not try to explain that acronym, CERCLA. Too many letters. I don't do FIFRA either. If the plant requires access to federal land, such as the coal facility currently proposed near Mesquite, Nevada, and St. George, those land uses will be subject to federal oversight under a multiple-use sustained yield management framework under statutes like FLPMA and NIFMA. There are a lot of these acronyms. It's fun. And the approval of these permits will trigger environmental process statutes like, and here's another one, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, requiring the federal agencies involved to study the environmental impacts of allowing the facility to go forward. Notice I said study, they don't have to actually respond. How these laws work is fascinating. Well, at least it is for a law professor. But far more interesting, I believe, is where the confluence of these two regimes leave us. If the old construct was energy and environmental regulation in separate spheres, the modern version is not that much different. The different worlds of energy and environmental policy remain. It is simply that they are now bridged together by environmental laws that also happen to, tangentially, influence how we consume energy. This is not a different system of energy regulation. It is one with another overlay of law by a separate set of regulators. That is hardly a revolution. So where is the revolution? An intelligent person acting on logic and reason might conclude that if the revolution in energy law is lacking in the traditional, even modernized version of that regulation, then where the change must be, where alternative law for energy must reside, is in the field of alternative energy. This would not be an unreasonable deduction, but it would be wrong. This is my assessment of the field, but I do not see the current frame of alternative energy regulation as that far off from traditional energy law. Alternative energy has its own dominant policy paradigm. It is characterized by a recurring pattern of 4 policy pillars. First, we declare an emergency, and politicians, policymakers, scientists, and economists pronounce the old system, the one where we simply supply our energy using 90% fossil fuels and nuclear, as unsustainable. Second, these realizations or re-realizations of the extent of the system being broken are followed by calls for change. Next, we throw piles of money at research and development in an attempt to tap the promise of renewable and other alternate energies. And fourth, as we do with conventional fuels, we select a few alternative technologies for special legal treatment and move on. We have all seen this dominant model of alternative energy regulation in action, but the full sweep of its play does not receive nearly enough attention. Even a small taste of it makes it plain. The political observation that our current system of energy regulation is broken and that something must be done to transform it reached back at least to Richard Nixon and continue uninterrupted from there. Here is what Nixon said in 1974. We will break the back of the energy crisis. We will lay the foundation for our future capacity to meet America's needs from America's own resources. This was 1974, a little while ago. Only 4 years later, President Carter was in office, and Congress followed Nixon's remarks, his bold statement, with a statement that was just as strong. This is what Congress said in 1978. The United States of America is faced with a finite and diminishing resource base of native fossil fuels, and as a consequence, must develop as quickly as possible a diversified, pluralistic national energy capability and posture. This is 1978. More recently, President Clinton, pointing to the threat of global warming, likewise exhorted for the need for regulatory change. This is what President Clinton said. We have become increasingly aware in recent decades that our sources of energy are finite. An interesting statement since in 1978. We already said they were finite. The long-term health of our nation and of our world require that we continually re-examine the ways we produce and consume energy. That was 1994. And perhaps the most insightful and most surprising statement of his White House tenure, no political commentary intended, Bush 43, in his 2006 State of the Union address, famously declared, "America is addicted to oil." It is not as though our government has taken no action to these fighting words. It has. It is just that that action almost invariably collapses to mere funding, and even that is quite meager. This slide shows the Federal Department of Energy's, or DOE, spending on research, design, and development for energy technologies from 1978, when funding for renewable energies really began in earnest, through 2006. As you can see, the difference is staggering. Even though we give lip service to promoting renewable energy solutions, that's all it is, lip service. In 1979, the year in which we spent more on renewable research than we ever have before or since, that funding was barely equivalent to what we spent on fossil fuel research in the same year, and not even 40% of what we spent on fossil fuels and nuclear combined. The trend has only continued. In 2006, the most recent year for which complete data is available, we did not spend on renewables and hydrogen research even a quarter of what we did in 1979. Wrong slide, there we go. And 2006 spending on renewables and hydrogen research remained at less than 40% of our spending on fossil fuels and nuclear, just as was our spending on efficiency and conservation research and development. When we look at cumulative spending over time, the lackluster commitment we have paid to renewables and energy conservation research is even more apparent. From 1978 through 2006, the ratio of total spending on fossil fuel and nuclear research to that on renewables, this is on a cumulative basis, was almost 3-to-1. And when we look at funding over a longer period of time, beginning in 1948, the margin of fossil fuel and nuclear research money is 4 times that for renewables and efficiency. Nearly $105 billion for fossil fuel and nuclear research, and barely $26.3 billion on renewables and efficiency. That's a lot of money. I don't know about you, but I have a hard enough time trying to help my first grader learn how to add hundreds and thousands. So when I sit down with my wife to talk about the billions of dollars floating around our house, grasping what numbers this large actually mean can be a bit ethereal. So I thought we might put these astronomical figures in a bit of perspective. Donald Trump, the Donald. If you've ever been looking for a winter home, Mr. Trump 2 years ago put his mansion in West Palm Beach, Florida up on the market. This is a posh pad, 62,000 square feet, 6.5 acres, 2 guest houses, parking for 40 people, right on the beach. So how much did Mr. Trump ask for this little piece of personal opulence? Anyone want to gather or venture a guess? I'm sorry? 10.5 million, okay. Anyone else want to bid on the Trump house here? 30 million? 50 million? 125 million. Who said that? You win the prize. The price tag for Mr. Trump's West Palm Beach mansion, $125 million. Okay. So here's the question. If we were going to use the money that the Department of Energy has put into research and development since 1948, okay, that's a while ago, right? 60 years ago, for a purpose other than the energy technology research and development, how many of Donald Trump's Florida mansions could we buy? Okay, well, with renewable and efficiency funds, we could have bought 210 of these mansions in 60 years. But with the money spent on fossil fuel and nuclear research, we could have bought 839. Now, I don't want to belabor the point, but I would like to add one more angle to this, to put in perspective how much money we actually are talking about here. If we look instead not only at what the Department of Energy has spent on energy research, but to how much our government spends on other programs, the 210 Trump mansions we could have purchased from 1948 through 2003 using our renewable energy research money begins to look even smaller than its differential from fossil fuel and nuclear research funds. Let's take just one example, the military. If we look at even just the last decade, from 1996 through 2005, of spending on the United States military versus on energy research, the ratio suddenly skyrockets to 340 to 1. In other words, we could have purchased roughly 82 of Trump's mansions with the DOE funds for renewables and 73 with the fossil fuel and research and development funds from this decade. But we could have bought 27,689 of them with the military money. Now, admittedly, my point here is simple, but I hope it is clear. We say as a nation, over and over, that we are concerned about moving away from traditional fossil fuels, but our only real response is to earmark money to research the question. That research is our only action, and the money we allocate toward it is so paltry in comparison to what we spend on other ventures that it doesn't even show up three-dimensionally on my three-dimensional chart. Oh, we have to go all the way back. There we go. In fact, if instead of buying Mr. Trump's mansions, every dollar our federal government spent between 1996 and 2005 could have purchased 10 square miles of land in the United States, the military funding would have purchased more land than the entire state of Texas. Whereas the money we spent on research for renewables, efficiency, nuclear, and fossil combined only would have purchased us the second smallest state in the nation, Delaware. Now, I may be going out on a limb here, but I would submit that this kind of funding is not meaningful alternative energy policy. Wendell Berry was right. What we have done thus far is not real action. It is not truly policy at all. Where is the action, the policy, and where will it be? How do we shed our old habits of half-hearted funding for something we say but do not actually believe in, to move to something more meaningful? How do we break free from this mold of energy and environmental law as disconnected concepts, when in actuality, the things these laws regulate could not be more entangled? Amory Lovins, the grandfather of much of the move to alternative energies, once wrote that America's energy future is choice, not fate. There are two paths. As we stand now on the cusp of this critical mass, the collective acceptance that our society is going to act somehow to combat climate change, we can do what we have always done, or we can do something much different. The old way would be to acknowledge that climate change is a problem, that it is caused by the emission of greenhouse gases, and to therefore resolve ourselves to reduce emissions and move on to the next crisis. This would be like building another bridge between the two worlds of energy and environmental regulation, and nothing more. But a new way, the better way, would be to look more broadly, to acknowledge climate change not simply as a result of greenhouse gas emissions, but as a result of the energy choices we make, of the way we build our societies, of our failure to combine our regulation of climate change with our regulation of energy, and then to do that. This would be a different version, a different vision. It would not be the building of just another bridge between these worlds, but a melding of them. Where we will ultimately arrive on this front is unclear, But there is encouraging early news that we may be abandoning the old, narrower view, and that already we may be seeing climate change as more than just emissions alone. Interestingly, the news thus far does not come from the federal level, but from a chorus of states. Perhaps the most encouraging is the adoption of renewable portfolio standards. A renewable portfolio standard is a simple but ingenious idea. It is a requirement that any entity selling electricity, typically at the retail level, must acquire a certain percentage of its power from renewable fuels. The requirements vary from Massachusetts' mandate of 4% renewables to Connecticut's mandate of 27%, for instance. Timing also varies by state, as does coverage, but the idea has caught fire. As of January of this year, nearly 60% of states, 29 plus the District of Columbia, have adopted renewable portfolio standard requirements. More critically, an effective RPS does not just help reduce greenhouse gas emissions by eliminating a portion of power that otherwise would have contributed to climate change. By creating a market for renewables, it also begins pushing us down the road to a more sustainable energy future. Another promising example of marrying energy and environmental policy is the nascent trend that Ned mentioned earlier of demand decoupling. The idea is this: increased efficiency is itself an energy resource, and by many calculations, one of the cheapest available. Utilities, however, have strong disincentives to encourage efficiency because greater sales typically equate with greater revenues and thus greater investor returns. But if we break that link, if we allow utilities to recover their expected revenues when conservation drives down their sales, we may be able to unleash the power of efficiency. Even more important, in my mind at least, we may also be able to harness utilities, some of the biggest players in the energy arena, to help spur change. The end game of any successful environmental transformation in this country will have to focus on creating a culture of sustainability. And big corporate players is not a bad place to start building that culture. Indeed, I would argue that not only should we decouple profits from demand, but we should go a step further. We should begin using rate making as an incentive to encourage conservation and environmentalism, perhaps ultimately tying rates entirely to these concepts and reliability of service. A final example of how we may combine energy and environmental law and policy is through the regulation of greenhouse gases itself. Some greenhouse gas proposals might not meld energy and environmental regulation in any meaningful way, but others, if designed correctly, may target that nexus directly. California, joined by 12 other states, including Utah, recently attempted this approach. They would have regulated the greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles in such a way that in all likelihood would have demanded cars to be more fuel efficient, increased energy efficiency. Whether these states will be able to impose these requirements is now tied up in litigation, but the concept is precisely the type of energy and environmental law we need going forward. Laws that recognize that the environment in which we live and the energy that we use are inextricably bound together. So tomorrow. We began with the question of what is energy regulation today. We now end with the question of what will energy regulation be tomorrow. I asked the question before, I ask it again. Can or will the crisis of climate change propel us to a new form of energy regulation that is integrated with the regulation of environmental protection and resource use? In short, a form of energy regulation aimed at long-term sustainability. Naysayers may claim that there is no reason to believe anything is different this time around. Climate change is the new environmental buzzword, but we have been here before. Just as rivers burned, 3 Mile Island malfunctioned, and the population bomb exploded in the last round of environmental lawmaking, we have heard calls for a cohesive national environmental policy in the past. Yet, here we are decades later, no progress made. The naysayers indeed may have a point. We have not answered the call in the past. But that does not mean we should not now. Just as there is a point that we are no different today, there is also a strong argument that climate change is. Climate change is not a discrete event, a short-term emergency. It is immense. It is not limited to affecting the environment in one way. Climate change affects virtually everything. That climate change's effects are likely to be so pervasive is reason enough alone to act. As the law school's own Professor Amy Wildermuth, who was so kind to introduce me, has argued in proposing a new brand of interwoven environmental law, because so many of the strategies for addressing climate change cut across media or the usual fragmentation of environmental issues, a more holistic approach may be adopted that would provide a model for this new kind of law. There is no reason why energy law also should not move to its own new model, one that begins the convergence with environmental law. Such a model could be the new dominant paradigm of energy regulation. It might be founded on these pillars. First, we should assert not just sufficient supplies of energy, but sustainable and sufficient supplies of energy. Second, we should maintain reasonable prices, but not just reasonable prices based on real costs and internalized costs. Third, we should harness the power of archetype firms to overhaul our energy structure and begin cultural change. Fourth, we should promote a deliberate move to renewable energy sources based on hard science and not pork barrels or politics. Finally, we should support competition among fuels, just as we do now, but on a level playing field. Make no mistake, I have no illusions that such a change as this would be modest. Modest it is not, but it is necessary. 3 years before Wendell Berry lamented our nation's lack of a meaningful energy policy, he made another related observation. He said this: the problems are our lives. In the developed countries, at least, the large problems occur because all of us are living either partly wrong or almost entirely wrong. It was not just the greed of corporate shareholders and the hubris of corporate executives that put the fate of Prince William Sound into one ship, an issue still percolating through the courts. It was also our demand that energy be cheap and plentiful. Climate change offers us an opportunity to enhance or to change energy regulation in a way that we so desperately need. It offers us an opportunity to change who we are and what we demand as a society. Climate change offers us an opportunity to prove Mr. Berry wrong. It gives us the chance to prove that we are living our lives right. Thank you. I think we do have a few minutes for questions if folks have any. Yes, please.
Will more Fed policy ensure each state with their own unique energy resources will really develop them, or just ensure that we get a coal-fired power plant?
Okay, so the question is about federal regulation versus state regulation and whether a federal regime risks sort of losing the different aspects of energy that different states have, and if it will actually create some sort of parity, or instead, as he puts it, just give Utah another coal plant. Well, Utah already receives almost all of its energy from coal, which is true of many states. And part of the problem that I see is with this. I mentioned renewable portfolio standards. People have talked for a long time about the race to the bottom or the race to the top, and the idea that states are either actors in that race to the bottom, that they have incentives to ease environmental regulations to attract business or for other political reasons, or if instead they are maybe pushing federal law and innovating law in a way that gives us new innovation we've never had. I think you can make the argument for both in this case. The fact that the federal government has failed thus far to respond to climate change regulation shows that the states are innovating in ways that the federal government has resisted so far, and that is important. But I think you also see the other aspect as well. Take the example of renewable portfolio standards, which I mentioned. Just from the two examples I gave, Massachusetts and Connecticut, you can see there's a wide array of how states address this question. So states like Massachusetts require 4% renewables, states like Connecticut require 27%, and there's an array within that. In fact, Iowa, the first state to do this, required 105 megawatts, which is effectively nothing. And they proudly proclaim on their website they've met their goal. I'm not surprised. And so you see the race to the bottom there as well, right? Because what happens is states don't act, and I think in some contexts there is a reason for federal regulation. And maybe the question is in the details and the design and how you set that level. And maybe you set a minimum. Maybe you follow some of the traditional ideas we have in environmental law where you set a minimum and let states go above it. But there is a need, I think, at least in the renewable portfolio context, for a federal standard that requires everyone to rise to meet that level, because otherwise what you have is you have a problem of leakage. And states that have renewable portfolio standards, rather than actually encouraging the development of renewable energy, will simply take it off from another state, and there was no net increase at all. Yes, please.
Kind of talking about patchwork and how that doesn't work, but I mean, can you extend that to the global? I mean, patchwork is such a problem. If naysayers have any strong points that the competition alone for that is good to kill this momentum we have already.
Right. Okay. So the question is about not just the difference between state regulation and the hodgepodge there, but the risk for selfish actors on an international stage. And I would agree with you. That is a definite problem. In fact, I would call for an international renewable portfolio standard. And maybe we need to go there. The international aspect of the climate change problem is the one that has been the most intractable. But what I would point out is that the most intractable part about the international aspect of climate change regulation is us. Yes?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wonder if I could get you to expound a little bit on the part you were talking about utility sector reform, and both decoupling and the question of using rates more effectively to deal with externality costs and that.
Sure. Okay.
And if you could, get in the Utah context.
Okay, happy to do it. So the question is about the idea I mentioned of demand decoupling and using rate-making tools in the utility context to help promote alternative energies. The traditional way that utilities are regulated from their rates, it's a little bit different now, but the traditional way was what's called just and reasonable rates, meaning that utilities were subject to regulation and a regulator at the state or federal level would decide what rate they could charge, and the rate had to be just, meaning that it was not unduly burdensome upon consumers, but also had to be reasonable, meaning that it would give them access to a reasonable rate of return such that they could achieve a return on their investment and attract additional capital. That's changed somewhat. We've moved to a market system in which we regulate at least wholesale rates at the market level, and FERC has had some problems with that. But all through the history of rate making, there has been the idea of incentive rates, and we've used them for different purposes. And so demand decoupling is one form of this. But demand decoupling, as far as it's been seen so far, really just allows for additional conservation. It doesn't encourage utilities in any meaningful way to actually go after and seek renewables. So what I would argue is that we need to do more of that. We need to push it even farther. And Utah, in fact, there are a number of states that have started this demand decoupling. It's been sort of in fits and starts, started in the 90s mostly, and then went away for a while. It's coming back. Utah has actually done it. I understand that Questar has some demand decoupled rates for their natural gas cells. All right. Please.
I'd like to follow up on the first question, the federal versus state regulation. I've been involved with the development of some purple wind farms up in Idaho.
Okay.
And to get this down to a real nuts and bolts kind of problem, the IPUC is funded by Idaho Power. So their paychecks come from the utility, not from the government. So if there's an issue between a private purple farm being built and the utility, the IPUC is going to rule every time in favor of the utility. And so the IPUC, on avoided cost rates under the PURP Act, has put in a 3-year moratorium while they argue about what should the avoided cost rate be? It's still not solved, but they finally lifted the moratorium, so wind farms are starting into construction in Idaho. But the avoided cost rate under PURPA is a mandated rate, but FERC doesn't enforce it. It doesn't come over and tell the utility, look, you have to pay, although the statute says they have to pay the avoided cost rate, they don't make the state actually perform and pay the avoided cost rate. So the state's down here offering maybe 25% of what the real avoided cost rate is, because the utility is arguing, well, we can't afford to pay the avoided cost rate, but in fact, that's what they pay if they build a coal plant. So how do you solve the problem of, you talked about, what was your phrase, rate making. It seems to me that the real answer is for FERC to get involved, even if it has to look on a state-by-state basis, which it probably would, and actually enforce the PURPA Act, for example, and force the utilities to actually pay the avoided cost rates so that the people can develop the wind farms. And in the delay process, the cost of the wind farm in Idaho has probably gone up it's gone up several $1 million.
Okay.
And then that complicates your financing.
Sure.
So when it comes to rate making, let's get down to the real practical level.
Right.
And how do we solve that?
Well,
how do you make the public utilities commissions actually support the development of green energy?
Right. Okay. So you heard the end of the question. The question is about how do we actually create real rate-making incentives, and is there a need for a federal hammer? And I think you're right. There is a need for a federal hammer. And the question about wind farms in Idaho and other places under the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act of 1978, that statute in many ways was seen as broken, and in fact was recognized by Congress as fairly broken because it didn't go far enough. So maybe we need to think about other ideas. One that has been used in Europe, for instance, is the idea of feed-in tariffs. That we can create real incentives and set prices at a much higher rate for fuels that we want to promote. And I would encourage that. I think that's a good idea. What we need to do, though, when we do that, is base it not on politics, but on science. Which of these are the best technologies for us to use going forward? That's the hard question. But I see that I'm out of time, so again, thank you very much.